So our next speaker, or in fact, it's a two-person team. We have Reem Alsalem and Rob Grace. Rob's from Brown University. Reem's an independent consultant from the Director of Global Humanitude, if I'm right. And I'm also pleased to note that they are the collaborators on a really excellent paper that is currently available on CHL's website in the Humanitarian Leader. And in fact, while they're presenting, I will put the link to that article into the chat message so that anyone who wants to can make a note of that for the future reference. So Rob and Reem, I'm not sure who's going first, but I do know that Reem needs to rush off to a meeting shortly. So I'll throw it over to you.
Actually, it's Rob who's going to go first.
Great. Okay, Rob.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. I will offer some introductory comments and then hand it over to Reem, who will present some of the findings from the research we did, and then I will come back in at the end for some concluding remarks. So we have called this presentation Humanitarian Negotiation, the State of Research, Practice, and Policy. And the starting point for this, this presentation is that there has been a growing recognition of the important role that humanitarian negotiation plays in humanitarian work. This started to gain traction in the 90s, and the past 20 years or so has really ballooned and exploded. There are many organizations involved in humanitarian capacity building and producing humanitarian negotiation handbooks. Here are a couple as well: Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, both of which have supported the research that that Reem and I have done. A few of the relevant handbooks there, and some research on humanitarian negotiation. And Joe's research that he just presented as well is indeed a valuable contribution to this space. Here are a couple pieces of mine that I have produced for a little self-promotion. But where Reem and I are coming in is that we believe that there is something that has been very much missing in all of this work, or at least has not been granted the attention that we think it deserves. And it's encapsulated, I think, very well by this quote that an interviewee said to me. This is a humanitarian worker that I interviewed about their humanitarian negotiation experiences. And that is, who says something is at least as important as what is being said. Humanitarian negotiation capacity building measures, they tend to focus on presenting some frameworks of negotiation, some tools to structure the negotiators' thinking. But what does not get emphasized in these efforts and in the overall discourse on humanitarian negotiation is this role of identity characteristics and diversity, and that how that plays into and how that shapes the humanitarian negotiation process. And this is something that we see to be relevant when humanitarians are negotiating with governments, non-state armed groups, negotiating internally amongst themselves or across different organizations. So here are a few details about the research that Reem and I conducted before I turn it over to her. We conducted, well, we actually combined sources of data that we had both collected initially independently, but on the same theme. First, 77 semi-structured interviews with humanitarian workers. And these were broad in scope, these interviews, asking interviewees about their experiences on humanitarian negotiation, and they raised issues of diversity and identity as they deemed relevant. Second, an online survey on humanitarian negotiation in the Middle East and North Africa region. There were 19 respondents to that survey. And the third source of data after the survey, semi-structured, a second set of semi-structured interviews were conducted with practitioners who were working in the MENA region. And these interviews were specifically focused on the theme of diversity and the profile of negotiators, so allowed for a more in-depth dive into that topic. And now I will turn it over to Reem. She will lay out what we found in this research. So Reem, I hand the Zoom floor to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So what I will be doing in the next few minutes is actually presenting just a quick overview of the 4 key dimensions of diversity that we have identified in our research and that impact humanitarian negotiations. As I will be talking, we will project on the slides some of the most compelling quotes made by humanitarian negotiators that we've spoken to. And as was mentioned, there are more details, of course, in the longer paper that is available. So the first sort of dimension is actually that of gender identity and sexual orientation. So as you may have guessed, gender can and was found to have an impact on negotiation due to a combination of factors: the counterpart's perception of gender, but also the capacities that the negotiator brings to bear that might be linked to one's gender identity. Now, gender can become an aggravating factor when combined with other dimensions of a negotiator's profile. So, for example, a negotiator who is both a woman and young may in some circumstances not be taken as seriously, or, for example, a woman that is a foreigner, a woman who is unmarried, but of course it depends on each context. In some, for example, areas, culturally conservative armed groups, may want to emphasize that the woman needs to respect local norms, and for them that would be important. What was interesting, though, is that several interviewees had highlighted that gender is not as important as other factors, and most certainly not a disabling factor. And the female negotiators we spoke to said that they were able to overcome their counterparts' biases against, their gender and their sex, and therefore it is a surmountable challenge even in conservative areas or theaters of operation. And interestingly, also, women found that they can have a distinctive advantage because, for example, the counterpart may expect a bit less of her. She can use the surprise factor quite effectively in these circumstances. And also the fact that, information collection needs assessments does have a gender dimension because, of course, female humanitarians can speak to the entire population, men, boys, women, girls. Therefore, female negotiators have really used that to their advantage. What was also quite insightful was that many felt that the humanitarian organizations actually continue to exhibit sexist behaviors, especially towards women. And therefore, many of the female interviewees we spoke to felt that they have to have thick skin in order to manage these situations. But of course, being judged by different yardsticks places female frontline negotiators under enormous professional pressure. Now, we did also look at what it means to be a humanitarian negotiator who is also a member of the LGBTQIA community. I regret that due to the length of the paper, we weren't able to include as many examples as we wanted of what that means. But basically, the example we shows that really you have to balance quite a lot of different factors when sending LGBTQI humanitarian negotiators to a certain scene. One is, of course, the value of your organization, of course, equity in the hiring process, competence, and of course, understanding the context. But what we couldn't show in the paper is that some of the people we spoke to felt that in certain conservative societies, if you exhibited behaviors that were supportive of LGBTQI persons, it might actually be, a source of tension or problem with the counterpart that you have. Next slide, please, Rob. Just very quickly on nationality, ethnicity, and cultural background, nationality was found to have a clear influence on humanitarian negotiation process. So, for example, being from a country that does not trigger a strong negative reaction was found to be useful. And what came across in this particular set of issues is that sometimes humanitarian organizations tend to oversimplify or lump together certain identities. Like, for example, they feel that you can send, for example, any Muslim to any Muslim country without, for example, taking into consideration the whole issue of the Sunni-Shiite divide, etc. That does play a role in some countries. Next one. Rob, yeah, on race and skin color and cultural factors. And since our research was focused on the MENA region, it came about that the color of one's skin did actually have an impact, as it can influence the counterpart's perception, in the sense that it seemed that a number of counterparts all too often assume that negotiators with darker skins are the more junior members of the team. Now, when it comes also to culture, beyond, these, let's say, generic issues that you may hear of in the humanitarian field, like don't shake hands with women, there was a sense that more effort needs to be made to really understand the cultural values and the traditions, but also understand what's beneath them and really delve into it and be proactive. Next one. When it comes to language, what was very interesting in the research is that, yes, language barriers do, of course, exist, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be a bad thing. Because when you work through an interpreter or a translator, the time you can buy sometimes to think about your response can actually be helpful, especially in, let's say, complex negotiation scenarios. And what was though interesting also is that the interpreters were found to have a very crucial role in all of this, but it wasn't always necessarily valued or appreciated. And not enough attention was given to actually forging a relationship with the interpreter, including them in the preparation for a negotiation scenario, etc. Next one. And of course, our research also delved a lot into the relationships between international and local staff and what it means to be local. Being local, of course, can sometimes mean that international staff feel that they know more than you by virtue of the fact that they've had international exposure in the work. And there was actually a lot of sort of material that shows that national staff have to often negotiate constantly space and legitimacy using the cultural and context-specific elements that they know will be beneficial to their position and to their role. So, for example, highlighting their family names, their connections, the area of origins, etc. So they use these cards in a way that can help them actually navigate the very complex situations. Now, finding that balance is important because they need to show that they're part of the community and therefore understand the concerns and the issues, but at the same time have to continuously try to keep a healthy distance and not to show that they are completely absorbed. Also because they still have to manage that relationship vis-a-vis their supervisors who are mostly international. And there, the issue that came up sometimes is that they feel, let's say, an inherent lack of trust by some of their colleagues and international or foreign supervisors because they are part of the community. And that is sometimes difficult to manage. especially when they feel that they're not sufficiently consulted. When it comes to age and physical attributes, age, if you're very, very young, sometimes that can work in your favor, but sometimes that can be seen as a sign of lack of experience. And the same thing for certain physical attributes. If you're very well built, for example, very fit, that can either come across as overbearing, or it can come across as, someone who is sort of disciplined and strong and so on. Last thing maybe I'll say about professional skills and profile, the past professional history can lend legitimacy to a negotiator's profile. So in particular, people who've had previous military experience and are negotiating with armed actors, that can actually strengthen their position. Now, seniority can also work both ways, in the sense that bringing in a more senior colleague to a negotiation scenario can sometimes be useful. But it can also sometimes immediately, let's say, escalate a situation, because it means that someone more senior is there, therefore they can, raise the stakes, therefore they can ask more things of that person. And with that, I'll hand back over to Rob for the sort of final conclusion. Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much. Just a few comments to close it out before we open it up to questions. I'll just highlight 3 overarching observations that we took from this research. One is, it was very clear from the data we collected that there is a sense that diversity matters, albeit in a context-specific manner. But we do think it's important, and interviewees did stress as well from their perspective, they believe this as well, that though it is context specific, and it has a sense of, in some cases, this dimension of identity and profile might matter. In some instances, it might be beneficial. In some senses, it might be more of a challenge. In this context, it might be a different situation. We shouldn't let that bring us away from the importance of diversity in humanitarian negotiation. And the sense is that profile blind approaches will not work, and that humanitarian negotiation as a field of study and practice should embrace the way that diversity plays into negotiation outcomes. Another element I'll highlight on this is that came across in Reem's comments is the importance of intersectionality. We did lay out the elements of profile one by one, but what was also clear is the importance of how these different elements of identity and profile interact in humanitarian negotiation processes. Second, identity characteristics shape how humanitarians view their negotiation counterparts. So the role of diversity, as Reem noted, it can shape how humanitarians are perceived by their counterparts, but it also can shape how humanitarians view their counterparts and how they analyze and think about the negotiation process, and the paper delves into that a little bit more. So that's the overall implication there, is that the bias that we're talking about can flow in 2 directions. And finally, also important to highlight, we see very much interlinked to this topic, is the internal dimensions of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, that these also matter very much. That yes, it's important to focus on the role of diversity and the importance of cultivating a diverse personnel, but you can't just do diversity alone without inclusion. Also important is cultivating an environment in your organization in which a diverse array of personnel across different identity characteristics all feel included, all feel that they have a voice. So we see very much these different strands of discourse and thinking and discussion that have been mostly operating in parallel with one another. On the one hand, diversity, inclusion in humanitarian work, even decolonization, which is obviously a very important theme to this conference on the one hand, and humanitarian negotiation. We see them very much intertwined. And the point that we want to stress for humanitarian negotiation specifically is the importance of humanitarian negotiation as a field of study and practice, opening up space, opening up more space to bring in those ideas of diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. I will leave it at that. Thank you all very much.